Hi everybody, we're just about to get started. Just give us another minute here. Okay, we're just at 1 o'clock now. So I just want to welcome everybody to our webinar today. We're going to be looking at net zero markets, and we've got some very esteemed experts in that field that are going to be having a panel discussion today. We're going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But before we get going, I'm going to hand it over to David Arkell from 360 Energy to introduce the company.
Yes, thanks, Julie, and good day, all participants. Just very quickly, I just want to give everyone a heads up about 360 Energy. We really understand the critical relationship between energy and carbon emissions. Over the past 25 years, we've helped customers in the manufacturing, greenhouse industry, and public sector to reduce their energy cost and carbon footprint. This was done by actually identifying their current status and then developing a plan, and then effectively embedding internal management techniques that they in place so they can better manage energy and carbon. Recognizing this, we are going to be introducing a range of services that will help customers on their net zero emission pathway. Clearly, climate change is driving companies to revisit their sustainability plans, and important financial stakeholders like investors, banks, insurance companies are demanding that sustainability plans address climate-related risks. If you haven't watched or listened to a previous 360 Energy webinar, I'd encourage you to check out our website and learn about how the Bank of Montreal is now offering sustainability-linked loans. While it's not new, it's clear that a focus on carbon reduction with a goal of zero emission is at the forefront of plans now for companies, especially with the increasing taxes and the environmental need to act now. I'm really excited to kick off our first virtual kitchen table in cooperation with the International Emission Trading Association to discuss the role of carbon markets. Before I hand over the reins to Julie and to Katie, who's our moderator, to go through this informative session, I'd like to shout out to Richard Adamson, the CEO of Industrial Climate Solutions, who also helped make this happen. And I'm really looking forward to hear this event this afternoon. So thank you all panelists and people who will be listening to the session. Back to you, Julie.
Okay, so just before we get started, I just wanted to go over just a couple of really quick housekeeping items. As per usual, we typically keep our attendees muted, just to keep down on background noise. Especially important today because we want to be able to hear all of our speakers. So if you do have any questions, and we do definitely encourage people to ask some questions, if you could please enter any questions into the questions function on your panel. Katie is going to be keeping an eye on that, and she'll be able to interject and get one of our experts to answer those questions as we go along. So without any further ado, I'm going to actually hand it over to Katie and the group here to introduce themselves and our discussion today. So over to you, Katie.
Thanks very much, Julie. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Wonderful. So first off, thank you to 360 Energy, the team, David, Julie, Don. Also the shout out to Richard Adamson, who reached out. Actually, we must have been partway through lockdown, wondering if AIDA might be interested in bringing some of its experienced wares and members, like we have here today, to talk about the latest state of play around carbon markets, globally, but more of a deep dive into carbon and environmental commodity markets across North America and where we see things headed in these markets, but also then give some thought to the leaning into the net to net zero. We hear about it a lot now, be it through government targets, carbon neutral, net zero targets, obviously corporate targets, and certainly with AIDA and our business community, we're about leaning into the net really and understanding the role the critical role that these markets play in facilitating and accelerating the transition to where we need to get to around the net zero journey, right? And we see these markets as not the end, but a really critical means to the end of where we're going. And there's certainly a lot of activity happening in this space, but also some recent insights given the recent COVID, pandemic impacts. And so I think, I'm really excited about today. And again, when Richard and 360 Energy reached out and asked, well, would you be interested in having an informal virtual kitchen table discussion with some experts, I jumped on it. So I'm really glad to see this come to fruition today. And yeah, just that reminder, we will be taking questions over the course of the next hour and a half in that questions tab in your dashboard. So please just put them through and I'll do my best keeping track and try to answer as many as we can before the time that we wrap. Okay, so Katie Sullivan is my name, Managing Director at AIDA. For those who are not familiar with AIDA, we've been around for over 20 years, came out of the UN process, represent around, over 130 businesses globally now as that collective business voice on market solutions to tackle climate. And so I was going to just provide a quick overview, some recent maps, just to capture, again, the latest state of these carbon pricing systems globally. But then what I'll do is we'll do a roundtable of intros and kind of tee up opening remarks and insights from each of our panelists. And so I just want to say I'm very delighted to have Nico Giraud-Nicolas from Clear Blue Markets. He's Managing Director, Head of Markets for Clear Blue. We also have James Renouf. James Renouf is the Director of Environmental Trading and Corporate Strategy at Capital Power Corporation. Then we have Alistair Hanley, the President of Radical, formerly Climate Smart Group, CCSI. They very recently rebranded to Radical, but I'll let him tell you more about that story. And then last but certainly not least, we have Arjun Padney, and he's the Vice President of Global Markets for Natural Climate Partners. We had a bit of an issue before during the testing session, so I don't see Arjun with us, but I'm sure he will be joining momentarily, certainly by the time I tee him up. All right, so we're going to share my screen now, and let's see if we can do it properly. I just want a confirmation. Can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Excellent. Okay, so 50,000 foot level, and I think it's just important for everybody on the phone to appreciate that this new report from the World Bank, it's the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. So certainly in our space, this is like the gospel of carbon pricing globally. It's a fantastic document. I think they actually really outdid themselves this year with the type of analysis and granular information on the design associated with these different carbon pricing systems. So this is just the map. You see there's a lot of flavors, right? A lot of colors. So it's not a black and white world anymore, when it comes to cap and trade or carbon tax. You have a lot of different in-betweens. And this just shares, right, the ETS where a carbon tax is also implemented, like in South Africa, Colombia, you have a tax, but where offsets and trading is a compliance mechanism that can be used. You obviously have the cap and trade systems, pure, like the EU emissions trading system. You have California and Quebec. You have then the emissions trading systems like the federal output-based pricing system or Alberta system. And then you have just pure taxes. So, I think now they had captured over 61 carbon pricing systems globally in 2020 that are either under development or they are live. They've been executed, right? So lots and lots of activity that is happening around the world on carbon pricing systems. So as I said, for today, we will be doing more of a deep dive into carbon markets, environmental markets across North America. So this just teases out kind of that very colorful, frenetic map on carbon pricing from the World Bank report. And then you have, actually, maybe it's even more frenetic, IETA's global carbon market map. So this is, and actually doesn't even capture all the markets, but all of these stars show where it's not, you know, the pure carbon taxes. These are the carbon markets, compliance markets that either exist today or are under development. And I have listed in the title there, we're really excited that we have launched, it's actually been a batch of 3 launches of IETA's new business briefs. And these business briefs provide a guide really to, well, any audience, but it very much is geared to business executive type audience that then digs into the state of these carbon markets, looking at some of the activity, the participation levels, the pricing we've seen and pricing forecasts. So we have over 20 of these business, brand new, hot off the presses business briefs that are available on our website and that we're really excited to share, again, globally with a lot of stakeholders so they can really be clear on where things are with some of these markets today. And I'll just mention quickly, because it'll come up over the course of our discussion later, that little fun airplane in the bottom of the screen there, that represents CORSIA, so the International Aviation Offsetting Program. And it's the first of its kind for a global sectoral market mechanism to address climate change and reach aviation targets globally. So again, we'll talk more about that later, but I wanted to provide that very broad, high-level flavor of certainly where the carbon market space is right now, and again, how much activity is happening, not just within our borders, whether you're in the US or Canada, but also outside of our borders, and certainly across some of our biggest key trade partners and competitors. All right. So I am going to pass the baton to Nico, who also has slides, and it's actually only myself and Nico that have some of these scene setter slides, but I think that it is worthwhile, given the number of these markets that are happening across North America. I think it's important for all of the participants, the registrants here today, to have a really clear picture of the region's carbon market players and the pricing that we're seeing today. Also, some of the very recent insights around COVID, especially related to the Western Climate Initiative market, Quebec, California. So, Nico, without going into too much detail, because goodness knows we can all go into a lot of the detail for these programs, can you just paint the current high-level picture across WCI and the Canadian carbon markets? And I will bring up your slides right now.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Katie. Thanks for the intro and thanks for the invitation today. So I'll highlight some of the latest developments in the North American carbon markets. Just a quick introduction for those that don't know us. Clear Blue Markets, we're an advisory company, and we help clients across all the carbon markets across the world, understanding those markets, understanding how they can profit from it, or understand how they can reduce their costs. So you see some of those markets in North America, Europe, but also South America and Asia. On the next slide, I'll start with the largest North American market, so pure carbon cap and trade market, the California market, who's linked with Quebec. And here, just on prices, there are daily prices that are published in this market. And what you see here is what happened in the past 2 months with the COVID pandemic. We did see prices increase as high as $18 before the crisis. And what you see here, the blue lines, these are the prices for allowances. And during this crisis, we saw prices go very low as $12, sorry. And we've seen since then prices recover and trading around $17 again now. So yeah, in most markets, what we've seen is a big dip, like in financial markets, but markets are coming back to a new normal. So that's for California. Some of the highlights now on the Canadian markets. On the next slide, Katie, please. And what you see here is the Canadian map with all the different schemes. And as I mentioned, Quebec is linked with California, and you currently have a price around $23 to $24 there. As well, we saw the dip in prices. Today, another cap and trade market, Nova Scotia, published the first auction result, and the auction result was $24. And then you've got hybrid systems, such as the one that you have in Alberta or also in Ontario, where you have a carbon tax, so a set price, and then some trading mechanism. On the left side, what you see here is the difference in prices. So different type of schemes, different prices, and that's prices that you see across Canada today between $23 and $40 essentially. And the red line is the interesting one. That's the price for the federal backstop, where prices will increase as high as $50 by 2022. So the advantage of those hybrid system as well is that it brings more price certainty, and you know where prices will be in the next few years, while in the cap and trade scheme, you rely on the market to set what the price is. On the next slide, I'll go and do a bit more of a deep dive into the new Canadian system, the OBPS, output-based pricing system, that was launched in 2019 in provinces such as Ontario, so the largest province in Canada. And to explain you a bit how that works, this scheme is essentially regulating mostly industrials, and those industrial will have a target based on some national production weighted average multiplied by a factor between 80% and 90%. Based on that, they'll then get a benchmark, and if they can beat this benchmark, then they'll get surplus credits that they can trade in the market, and if they don't, then they'll be able to either pay a tax, use offsets, or use surplus credits. So again, a lot of different mechanisms, different prices, and what you see here on the next slide then is our view then on the Ontario market. This output-based pricing system where essentially the price is fixed. It is a pretty new system. The first compliance year was 2019, and this system will continue until 2022. After that, we'll need to see what happens. But essentially what we see here is that is interesting is that as it is a new market, there isn't that much creation of credits, and so it will be a very short market, and that's what you see here on the right chart, where you see the total emissions and the demand that we expect for credits between 7 and 9 million credits, and then this position where essentially we don't think that there'll be much credit creation. In this system, you'll be able to either use provincial offsets, so offsets from Alberta or Quebec or British Columbia, or you'll be able to use offsets from a federal system that is yet to be implemented. So that's on Ontario, and a bit of a across Canada, different systems and how they function. High level.
All right. We're not getting into the CFS yet, but that was a teaser for, there will be some clean fuel standard discussions later. So thanks very much, Nico. And actually, before I tee up James, maybe I should stop there. Before I tee up James, I think, just for Nico, and I didn't do a great job actually introducing you and just your experience here, but, you have lots of deep experience across the European and North American markets. And you also help develop these in-house models, supply-demand models, right, at Clearblue, that are helping, clients and others navigate these different programs and compliance, opportunities, investment opportunities. But you also come from power utility, major power utility with experience in these commodity markets, right, and the financial sector. So very quickly, Nico, I think it would be helpful for people to know, when we talk about the California market and just the size of it, right? How many facilities hold compliance obligations under, California's cap and trade system? Ballpark.
Ballpark. I would say, thousands of entities, or in the California system. And yeah, I mean, yeah, something that I haven't mentioned and difference between all those schemes and where we're also very active is in the cap and trade system, you don't really have certainty on prices. There is a floor on prices, so you know what the minimum price will be. But then for investors or for industrials, it's important to know what the price will be in the next 10 years so they can make sure what their return will be on investment. So that's a lot of the work we do there as well. While yeah, in OBPS type system, carbon tax system, you have much more price certainty, and that's great for development of new projects. But at the same time, yeah, those schemes don't really ensure you that you'll get emission reduction in the system, or doesn't ensure you how many emission reduction you'll get in the system. So that's yeah, a lot of the work we do is understand those schemes, help industrials understand those schemes and how they can invest in those schemes and yeah, like monetize their emission reductions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Nico. And again, I think for context purposes, when you look at the federal output-based pricing system, which is like one of the newest kids on the block, right? There is the opt-in provision as well. So even though it's the threshold 50,000 tons and over of these large emitters, we also have a number of these entities that are below 50,000 but have chosen to opt into the trading system for a variety of reasons, including, you know, cost benefits, associated flexibilities. So I think it's over 300 facilities now that have these obligations under the federal output-based pricing system. But we can dig more into that later. I think,
but I think something as well important to highlight on that as well, Katie, is the fact that for all those companies, it's also important to be in those schemes to understand how yeah prices change in those schemes or how they like their competition also acts in these systems, and yeah, potentially to get a competitive advantage as well.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Nico. So James, you know, like I said, leading up environmental markets, and then the environmental commodity desk at Capital Power, but you're also deeply involved in the corporate strategy team at Capital Power. And I've had the pleasure of working, you know, with you and many of your colleagues across practically all of the North American carbon markets, because you are players, some with compliance obligations and or, you know, trading positions. So, you know, James, if you could just quickly introduce, like, just even your role at Capital Power, some of that history evolution of, you know, Capital's involvement, and really, you know, support and embrace and capitalizing on opportunities with these markets. And, you know, I think that would just be really worthwhile. And also just from that context or the vantage point of like a major power utility, including thermal, in your involvement. So James, do you want to share some insights?
Sure, thanks, Katie. I'll just do a quick sound check, make sure folks can hear me. So in terms of my role at Capital Power, and what I do, you mentioned, sir, I manage our environmental trading and compliance, and then I have been involved in our corporate strategy, and I should clarify that I guess, sort of somewhat graduated from that, but I'm involved in new technology now, which is a good extension into some of the net zero conversations. But I think kind of just getting back to the overall sort of environmental trading and what we do and some of the learnings that we've had through that process. Quick background on Capital Power. We are a North American power company. We're headquartered in Edmonton, Alberta. As Katie mentioned, we have thermal generation. The majority of our investments last 5 years have been kind of a split between thermal, natural gas, and renewables, primarily wind generation. And we also have some legacy coal assets in our Genesee fleet here in Alberta. So in terms of that sort of asset base, we have about 6,500 megawatts in total. And probably our journey on the markets trading side goes all the way back to over 15 years ago, previous to when the Alberta Large Emitters Program, specified gas emitters, is being introduced. We started to get involved in voluntary markets and understand that piece. And as the regulation was introduced, we began procuring offsets that we could use to satisfy our compliance obligation, i.e. an alternative mechanism that lowers the cost. Instead of paying the tax, the idea is you buy the offset for a cheaper price and it reduces the cost of compliance. And I think that was at that time kind of when the light bulb came on for, okay, how do we use these markets? How do we begin understanding them? And I think, to Capital Power's credit, and this is even before my time in the group, is we treated environmental not as a cost, as a compliance piece, but as a commodity. And so the way that I think about it, and the way we approach it now today, is it's just like an input commodity. So if you have a natural gas generator, you have natural gas going in, and if you're creating, emissions on the other end, there's a cost to that piece. Or if you have renewable generation, there's a credit or a value to that. And to the extent we look at that as a commodity, that's how we built out how we cover markets and understand the sort of benefits and liabilities of different schemes. So we've used that over time, and we now are active in various North American markets, be it renewables or carbon. And so I think, just kind of thinking back on that, or what are some of the key pieces, or how we look at carbon markets and how we interface with them. I would say there's maybe like 4 pieces that I look at, which is sort of clear, steady, transparent rules. To start with, that might seem like table stakes, but I would suggest that it's probably the most important thing. It's key to some of the things that we're starting to do to progress on, towards net zero well down the line. But if you don't have clear policy, if we didn't expect that the policy would stick around, we're not going to make the investments in our assets to improve them. The other piece I would say, broad coverage, fungibility, and trading is key to reducing cost. And Nico's touched on this a little bit in sort of his opening comments about cap and trade markets, and just the way I think of them is you can take, on one end, a command and control mechanism, and the other end would be a cap and trade program. Ideally, in an economic standpoint, you have a cap and trade program because that lowers the cost. The whole concept of that idea is to say, all right, if there's a broad swath of industry, one industry can reduce its emissions more than another, and when you just work within a cap, that creates trading opportunities and it creates lower cost. And that's just the basic concept there. I would caveat kind of what comes in the middle of that is not command and control, but a tax. But what I've seen over time is a tax system is workable, such as we have in Alberta, as long as there's good alternative compliance mechanisms that can lower your cost of compliance. So that example is offsets, and instead of paying the tax, ideally you can reduce that cost. And so what I've seen is if systems are well designed, you can have a cap and trade or a tax program as long as you have the right alternative compliance mechanism. So that third point there is, Nico again was touching on this a little bit, of potentially some undersupply. To have a good system that truly lowers the cost, if you have a kind of a tax-based or output-based pricing, you do need robust protocols that have a good supply there. And if there's an undersupply, it just gets you back to paying the tax. So you need enough sort of supply of these instruments to be able to actually reduce compliance costs and reduce emissions. And the fourth one I touch on just in closing here is the industry versus facility-based benchmarks. Ideally, you have an industry benchmark as opposed to a facility-based benchmark so that you're competing together. Good example, again, is Alberta. For electricity, we have an industry-based benchmark, and so you're competing within that industry to one benchmark. So those are the quick pieces and maybe what we've learned over the last 15 years from the carbon side, Katie.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic insights, James. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to digging into some of those comments a bit more and unpacking them later in the discussion. So I think what we'll do is, we're going to head to Alistair Hanley, president of Radical. Like I said, just went through a big brand change last week, and it's really quite exciting to see where, Alistair's original, like the companies, and when I first had the pleasure of meeting Alistair many moons ago, it was a relatively small company that was born out of Alberta's carbon market. So that, that was back 2007. Alberta's market's been around for a very long time. It's evolved quite a bit in those years, but that's really where, Alistair started. And now, both domestically in Canada, but also internationally, Alistair has quite an incredible team and is playing a big role in helping to actually inform the design of some of these carbon markets, and certainly as just a project developer, technology provider, being involved in the execution and the market itself as a participant and facilitator. So Alistair, I think I'll tee you up right now. If you want to, maybe talking a bit more about your birth in Alberta's carbon market, how it's kind of grown and expanded, kind of flourished, but also when you look about some of those specific success stories in Alberta system in particular, what are some of the things that you might glom onto or help to communicate to not just a domestic but international audience that you're dealing with regularly now?
Yeah, Thank you. Thanks, Katie, and thanks for the kind introduction. It is interesting when I reflect back on the start in the space back in 2007 and 2008, just how far we've come and what we've been able to achieve as a result of Alberta's market. And like James said, the key things that Capital Power needs around things like market certainty and price certainty and supply is those things that are drivers for the purchasers of credits are the same drivers for those of us that are trying to generate these credits for our clients. And when we started the organization back in 2008, I think we were 4 people with maybe a couple $100, it seems, in our pocket. And today, Radical is operating in Brazil, the States, and Canada, and we're growing at a prodigious rate. And for those people who, and what I say for people who say that these carbon taxes are a job killer, we onboarded 9 new people during the COVID crisis. And we needed those people just to keep up with the work that we're doing. So this market and these market mechanisms do create jobs and they do create value. And so for us, some key takeaways for us on our growth, there's a lot of things that the Alberta market did at the beginning which maybe weren't 100% right, or they weren't perfect, but they were good enough to get the market going. And that was a critical component. Alberta went forward with a market framework that allowed people to start to get in and develop credits. I got to plug in my computer here. Develop credits and buy credits. And it was done in a manner where everyone agreed that we were going to learn by doing. So the government was going to learn by doing, project developers would learn by doing, verifiers would learn by doing, and the buyers would learn by doing. And from our early days in the market in 2007, at that time, the biggest source of credits were from the agricultural sector, which is the area that we were developing them in. And that kickstarted the market. And what we've seen since 2007 is we've seen a diversification of credit supply. We've seen protocols come and go, and we've seen the quality of the carbon credits being developed rise year over year. There were some issues with some of the early carbon credits that were developed. I think honest mistakes, right, that led to some problems. But in that spirit of continuous improvement and continuous learning, everyone in the market's benefited. And for Radical, we've been able to develop a great team of people that want to make an impact, not just in Canada or the States or Brazil, but at a large scale. And what we're really keen on doing now is looking at how we can enable markets that will allow more credits from natural climate solutions. And that's a real challenge. In Alberta, there's been, I think it's 20 plus million, no, maybe not that much, 15 to 18 million credits that have come out of the agricultural sector. And we're the only jurisdiction in the world that's been able to do that to that scale. And while other countries or jurisdictions are trying, they're struggling with there's challenges within it. There's challenges on a bunch of different levels. And just to put it into context, in the United States today, there's 9 different programs or protocols that are in development, have been developed to generate carbon credits from grain growers in the United States. So rice growers, corn growers, soybean growers. And to date, the volume of credits generated out of those 9 methodologies is, I think it's less than 800 at a total cost of probably north of 5 million to 6 million US dollars, which has been invested by government and individuals trying to make this happen. So the Alberta story shows that we can do it. And there's lots of great techniques that can help to facilitate that. But now what we need to do, the royal we, is figure out how to create these natural climate solutions in markets around the world and demonstrate that we can create credible emission reductions to bring to the market.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alistair. And I think, just so we're all very clear, including the participants, the natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions, they're synonymous, NCS, NBS, right? And so, Alistair, very quickly, your definition of NCS, please.
My definition of natural climate solutions. Thanks, Katie. You didn't say you were going to ask me this question. So I would suggest that when we look at natural climate solutions, I would actually use the definition of any natural process that is going to either reduce emissions or remove remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And so the way I look at that, it could be projects of what we call blue carbon. It could be projects where we're dealing with things in forestry. It could be carbon sequestration in the soils in agricultural practices, or it could be reducing methane emissions from anaerobic decomposition by using methanogens to consume the methane and convert it into carbon dioxide. Right? These are all natural systems that we can leverage to bring our CO2 numbers in the atmosphere down.
You passed. Well done. That was it.
Good. Thank you. Lots of pressure.
So I know, I mean, given the surge of interest, I'd say like since the IPCC 1.5 degree report at the end of 2018, and just, you know, the recognition globally and the surge of interest in NCS, you know, opportunities and the role that markets play in driving NCS at scale. It's big, and it's certainly something IETA is deeply involved with globally. But we can come back to that. So do we have Arjun Padney? Not with us by video, unfortunately, but on the phone?
We don't have Arjun yet. We're trying to get him on. I'm trying something else.
You keep on troubleshooting. That's fine. So hopefully we can welcome Arjun when he comes. I know there was a bit of a bandwidth issue. And these are just the experiences you have when your world is virtual these days. So let's then circle back to Nico, because, you know, you obviously touched on it a bit, but I think it's worth unpacking a bit more around what we are seeing, especially in the bigger compliance carbon markets in North America. So COVID, right? COVID impacts. And the latest, you know, May auction we saw in California, Quebec, undersubscribed. I mean, well, really you and the team in thinking through the COVID impacts on the carbon markets, but also some future scenarios, what to expect over the coming quarters and into 2021. Nico.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Katie. I think the first thing to think about is what is the scope of the carbon scheme. So, for example, in Canada, in the OBPS, you've got mostly industrials and power production, but in California, you also have fuel distribution and heating. And so if you look at the impact of COVID, of course, yeah, there's been a larger impact on fuel distribution because people stopped driving. So in terms of emissions in this scheme, in the Californian Quebec scheme, there's been more reductions caused by this crisis. And we estimate it's around like 15 to 20% emission reduction compared to 2019 for California. And then if you look at the industrials, well, they've reduced production during the crisis, but not as much. And some of them have managed to run during the crisis. And so there's less impact in those type of schemes. And for example, in Alberta, where coal plants have been running during the crisis as well. So essentially emissions have not really reduced in Alberta so much. So it really depends on each scheme. Overall, I would say that the regulators have always thought about crisis, and like the financial crisis of 2008 was a good example to make sure that those schemes would be strong enough to waiver all those emission reductions. And yeah, so that is the first thing. So emission reduced, but emissions will increase again, and it will take some time depending on how the economy recovers. Is it going to be a V shape or W, whatever shape you want to talk about? Emissions will increase again, and the demand will pick up again for all those different offsets or allowances. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing that, and then on the second thing I wanted to touch upon is the delays. So there's been a lot of delays. So for example, for compliances in Ontario, the compliance for 2019 was supposed to be in December 2020, was pushed back to this April 21 now. So there is a lot of delays, but overall, despite the crisis, those schemes have continued functioning. Auctions have taken place, and so we saw the last auction in California take place and clear at the floor, so at a low level, but it makes sense because the emissions reduce. But overall, all those schemes seems to be strong, and again, as long as market certainty is there, that should push investments into those markets. And I think the crisis have shown that all those schemes are pretty strong.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. And I think like going to James, James, you might actually have something to share again related to just the current COVID situation, some of the outlooks, how capital's interpreting it and its involvement in these markets. But also, I think it's worthwhile to hear you're involved with the corporate strategy team, and Capital they released their first climate disclosure in 2019, right? There's a lot of components to Capital's climate strategy broadly, and that's everything from the technology piece. It's not just the markets, but I'd love for you to maybe shed a bit more light on Capital's, the climate commitments broad, all these different pieces to the strategy, and then more like leaning into the markets component to that strategy. Did I tee up okay, James?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, so sure. Maybe I'll just start with we've sort of recently publicly stated our ambition to reach net zero for 2050 across our fleet. When I think about that kind of broad swath of getting into how markets impact this, how we look at technology, those pieces, I would sort of take this as, well, how are we contextualizing this situation? How do we realize it? And then from that, I kind of draw, where do we go with our commitments and what are we trying to do, and how does the sort of policy and carbon market bolster that piece? So I think, starting there with the context and how we view it, we still expect that markets have to be create reliable power, create affordable power, and now this kind of plank of sustainability as you get towards net zero. So with those kind of pieces in mind, and keeping that in mind, what is the future state that we're looking at? Kind of simply, I think about that of you want production to be zero or near zero. So from a power standpoint, when we think about power, if we're producing power, we have thermal generation, that most of that CO2 has to come out of that process. When I think about the usage of energy and power, this goes whether it's just electricity or beyond that, you want what's consumed to be zero or near zero emissions. So the types of those fuels you're thinking would be electricity, would be hydrogen, potentially renewable natural gas. Those pieces is where we need to be getting to. And I think the third big piece that I would put in there, and when we think about the net part of it, and when we think about net zero, is getting to even near zero is potentially pretty expensive. So when we look from a technology side, we start to think about things like carbon conversion and direct air carbon capture. And we also think about things like natural climate solutions. We were just talking with Alistair about that, of those pieces playing a big part. But that's the right thing to do. And that's how you kind of put together all of those pieces of sustainability and affordability and reliability. So that's kind of how we contextualize it. When I would say, what are we doing, the targets that we're setting, as I mentioned, we've kind of had this idea of, yes, we want to, that's our aspirational goal, is to achieve that by 2050. We put actual targets in place for our existing fleet through 2030, and just how we think about those next technology stages and pieces there. Well, as I just mentioned, or as we were talking about, is we have thermal generation, we have renewable generation. Renewable is obviously effectively net zero already, but from that technology suite to keep that reliability and affordability. In Canada, you probably hear this example a lot from electricity side, but we need to keep the lights on when it's -30 in January and there's not wind blowing for several days and there's not a lot of sunshine. So when we think about that, we have to look at our fleet and start taking from the production side those emissions out of there. So we're looking at those technologies. And so what we're doing through 2030, for example, targets that we put in place that are relevant to this are, we've committed to reduce our net emissions by 10% from our fleet level while increasing our total generation by 145%. So that's a big piece of what we're doing on the generation side, and that includes switching our assets from our legacy coal assets to dual fuel to fire natural gas, but also includes a big technology advancement that we're trying to do through digitalization at the facilities, just better technology to reduce fuel consumption, which reduces emissions and creates value. So those are the types of things we're putting in place for through 2030. We've also committed to ensuring that our assets are carbon capture or hydrogen ready for any new builds that we would do, because we look at that next step, that production has to kind of get towards net zero beyond that. So those are the types of things we're building towards. When I think about how carbon in that platform of policy and what's happening, kind of bolsters onto that, it's two pieces. As I've said, the goal is net zero across that. And we know already, if you're looking at these things that we're talking about for the next stage to bend the curve, we need some fairly expensive technologies to do it. That's why we also include things like we see robust offset platforms and protocols and natural climate solutions as being a really big part there, just from what happens going forward is the one piece on carbon. And I would say that the final piece of how we look at it, just the policy and a price on carbon starts propelling you to do different things. A lot of the stuff and the what we're moving forward with now is because we look at the policy that's in place and we're able to start moving forward with these changes to our generation fleet. So I think that's kind of like the general view of how we see the overview and what we're doing with our targets towards net zero.
That's great, James. And I think, can I ask, I'd say 2018 through 2019, with the flurry of elections that we had, and there was a lot of uncertainty across these carbon market programs, again, in 2018, 2019, how would you, probably it's to you and Alistair, how are you generally feeling confidence-wise around the markets today? As you said earlier, the biggest killer for this space is, stroke of pen risk, right? Policy changes and, or, these markets just suddenly going poof, right? Like we saw in Ontario, and then a dramatic shift to suddenly Ontario emitters have to then think about and comply with the federal output-based pricing system. So like your quick hot take around just how you're feeling confidence-wise, or are there still some pretty looming uncertainties related to Alberta or some of the provincial programs and like even federally right now? James first and then Alistair.
Sure. So, I mean, when I look at Alberta, we've gotten comfortable with Alberta. And I would see the key of that is keeping equivalency with the Canadian program. So I see if stringency around the program as well as the price. So the big question is, we have a court case that's been pushed back, and what happens next year for pricing and those pieces. But I think in general, the expectation is that we'll keep that equivalency. That's the big question that I would have on Alberta in my mind, and where to go from there. But I would expect from the types of protocols and offsets and what's in that program to move forward. And it's fairly, there's a well-defined process for what's in there, and generally pretty comfortable with that program. From a federal point of view, and I'm sure, Alistair will get into these pieces too, but yes, we have a program in place, but there's not alternative compliance mechanisms there to actually reduce the cost of compliance. So we understand the policy and what's been brought through in the regulation, but we need some ways to actually, reduce our compliance costs.
Thanks, James. And, Alistair, did you want to share anything?
Yeah, I think generally I would suggest we're bullish on Alberta, but we're not foolish. And so we wouldn't be betting the farm on the Alberta offset system or market staying in perpetuity. I think that's where it's going to go. But as a result of that, and as a result of some of the, I'll say the lack of urgency, the lack of speed around creating compliance mechanisms under the OBPS, that's why we've shifted our business a little bit, or starting to shift our business into other jurisdictions so that we have less risk here, or we diversifying our risk from a jurisdictional perspective, but also from the core pillars of the business are shifting and growing as well, also to mitigate that risk.
Yeah.
But you know, what we've seen in Alberta, and Chelsea was on one of your webinars earlier, is we still are seeing very robust pricing. We're not seeing a decline in price. And what's interesting, I looked it up this morning, currently there's $503 million worth of active offsets and EPCs in the market, and that's their compliance value right now that's active on the registry. And if we go to $50 a ton, that takes it up to $836 million value for the active offsets. So is the government going to simply wipe that capital investment or that value out? I don't think so, right? But it also gives you some indication of the dollar values that we're talking about that are active today.
And just going so we're clear with the participants, I mean, having this court case, right? AIDA is the only business intervener, and all of these constitutional challenges to federal carbon pricing legislation, and the big one is the Supreme Court case that we'll see virtually, at least in September. So hopefully having some clarity around how the Supreme Court decides will be an important one. I think I know certainly for business and these programs. I am going to do a test to see if Arjun can speak. Is Arjun on the phone? Okay, I got a note from 360 Energy that they did bring him on, but I guess we're still having audio issues. So I think we'll still wait. And I recognize that certainly with some of the registrants, and what Arjun was going to be digging into a bit more was the voluntary market, right? I know that certainly some of you can speak to the voluntary space, but as the VP of Global Markets for Natural Climate Partners, Arjun is deeply involved with a lot of these corporates. I think it's across some 300 clients, 30 countries, these carbon neutral net zero corporate targets, and helping them navigate that journey and also procure offsets. So we'll again see if Arjun joins us in a sec. But maybe with that as Satter, Nico, I still have a few slides, right? That for like the different issue areas. So I don't think Arjun was going to be providing a forecast of just some of the voluntary market developments, but your team has recently done a great analysis, both on aviation and voluntary. So I have one slide here of some of the recent commitments that I'll bring up, and maybe you can share some highlights from your latest report.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Katie. So yeah, I mean, the first thing we did is look at the demand for voluntary offsets and what type of industry were purchasing those offsets. And looking at it, yeah, there's different sectors that you can talk about. There's of course all the IT companies, so Microsoft, Google, that are purchasing offsets. Then you've got the aviation company that you see here that started buying offsets a few years back, and I'll mention Corsia later on. So there is a new scheme coming for them. Then you've got the European oil and gas companies such as BP or Shell that have been purchasing offsets and also offering to customers in Europe to buy offsets when they buy fuel, for example. And finally, you've got consumer goods such as food companies. I see Maple Leaf on that slide. So these are like the five main or those four main sectors that are purchasing offsets and will be purchasing offsets in the future. And before COVID, we expected airlines to be the largest buyer. And I think if you go to the next slide, maybe that will explain a bit more what happened here. And so, yeah, what was going to happen with airlines was that there was this new scheme starting Corsia, and Corsia worked with a baseline based on years of 2019 and 2020. And for any emissions above this baseline, companies would have to buy offsets. And so with emissions from the airline sector increasing every year by 5 to 6%, there was a lot of demand expected from this market. However, with COVID, what we saw here on the right chart, what you can see is that emissions are expected to reduce drastically in 2020, and that they will take time before it recovers. And we do think that it will take at least 2 or 3 years minimum to see their emissions recover. And then the other discussion we have here with Corsia was the baseline. So at first, the baseline was supposed to be based on 2019 and 2020, but it seems like there's been a lot of pushback because of the reduced emissions in 2020, and the new baseline might be 2019, and that will be decided in the coming days, I think. and that will again reduce the demand. So CORSIA in the aviation sector will add a lot of demand, probably not in the next 2 or 3 years, but after that, airlines will definitely a very large buyer. And I would say, meanwhile, consumer goods, IT companies, and especially oil and gas companies have been very active in these markets. And that's what we see on our side is oil and gas companies very active looking at nature-based solution type of voluntary offsets, but also banks, a lot of North American and European banks looking at getting involved in those markets to essentially help their customers offset their emissions.
It's really a remarkable list, and like the activity, and even through the last couple of months and with COVID, that at least from our vantage point, we haven't seen a lot, if any, of like retreating. We've actually seen even more announcements, and from a lot of different types of major companies, be it the oil and gas or the Amazons, and it's there's quite a lot of action happening in the voluntary space. Let me see, just so stop sharing screen.
Can I just interject and see if I can get Arjun to say something now?
I'm here, yes.
Thank you. Phew. We are worried about you, Arjun. Okay, we can't see your face, unfortunately, but we can hear you loud and clear. I hope that you actually listened to that last kind of scene setter with Nico talking about the voluntary market and my comments. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did. I've heard most of the webinar as well. You just couldn't hear me, unfortunately. So I'm up to speed on where the discussion is pretty well.
Okay.
My deep apologies for technical difficulties.
Not your fault. We're all about being flexible and adaptable, and I'm just glad that we have you right now. So let me then do a proper tee up, like I said, leading up VP Global Markets for Natural Climate Partners. And before that, though, Arjun, we've known you for a while. You were the Director of Policy at the American Carbon Registry. And then actually before that, you helped create and run Cargill's US Carbon Desk. So loads of experience. And again, you heard my comments earlier. So like would love your hot take on what you're seeing both in the US, but also globally around the voluntary carbon market space.
Sure, yeah, happy to comment on that. So, I mean, as you mentioned, the voluntary market has really picked up in the last couple of years. And one of the, aside from picking up, it's also sort of evolving in its focus. And the biggest way that the thing that we're seeing in that respect is the net zero commitments, and within that, the focus on removals. So removals of CO2 from the atmosphere rather than avoidance of GHG emissions. And we can debate the merits of each or whether we in fact need both, but the fact of the matter is that an increasing number of companies are focusing on approaches that remove GHG, CO2 from the atmosphere, and largely, that means afforestation and reforestation projects in the voluntary market. The challenge there, or the few challenges. One is the main one is that it takes time for trees to grow, and therefore, getting the immediate reductions that we want and need, and that the corporates want, faces a supply constraint in that regard. But simply in terms of the number of projects out there, there is a lack of supply, particularly then if we start looking at certain geographies that are of interest. And then if we also, if a corporate wants to exclude plantation, afforestation, reforestation, that further narrows the funnel. Now, I mean, plantations themselves is another conversation as to sustainably grown timber and certifications for that, and the avoidance of cutting down old growth forests through plantations. That's a whole other conversation. But we do have these drivers for afforestation, reforestation, certain geographies, and particularly sort of approaches that are more along the lines of a rewilding, and then the supply gets really tight in that regard, and that's one of the challenges that we're seeing these days in the voluntary market.
That's great. And actually, while we have you, Arjun, so looking at the voluntary market through 2020, really well through 2030. So the Paris Agreement world is very different than the Kyoto world, and you start then to see, with all the emergence of all these compliance programs in North America and globally, right? How then the voluntary market is, dancing, interacting with these and then, actual compliance markets, but also then like national accounting versus the corporate accounting. Do you have any, thoughts about how exactly we might see the voluntary market morph and just some of these, without going into too many details, because we all know we can nerd out when it comes to accounting. But do you have any, insights to share with participants about this situation?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I could spend the rest of the webinar talking about this issue, but I won't. So just to give some context, the issue for those who aren't familiar with it is one of primarily of the concern about possible double counting. So if say a corporate in the in Europe buys offsets from a project in Africa. And that country in Africa where the project is hosted has its own commitment under the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contribution, NDC. Is it double counting then for that company to buy those offsets and retire them against its own footprint if the country itself, the host country, is also counting that emissions reduction against its footprint? That's certainly something that's in discussion, and I'd say the view on that is evolving. The issues are that companies exist within countries, not as entirely separate entities, and as long as there's, from our perspective, as long as there's no reporting by corporates of those reductions, in their home countries, which there essentially never is, then it's purely an accounting issue that does not incur a double counting of claims concern. Now, having said that, there's enough concern out there that we are starting to see instances where there are countries that are saying, "Whoa, we want to slow down on this because we're not sure." The rule book has not yet been written on how we're supposed to count these reductions, and maybe we do need these reductions for our own targets. So, I mean, for the most part, it's as of today, in the vast majority of cases, it is still not an issue, and our position is that we want more capital. Private capital to go towards reductions, and we don't want to see, a disincentive in that regard. We don't want to dissuade corporates from putting their capital to work for emissions reductions projects out of concern for what is essentially a technical accounting issue. But that conversation is evolving, and so far it is largely not an issue. But I will say we have seen some instances where, particularly in Madagascar, for example, where there is something of a hold on activity because of those types of concerns.
Yeah, no, I think you answered that quite well, and it's quite fair, and it's very much a live topic right now, and certainly that space around when Arjun references the rule book, we're talking about the operationalization of the Paris Agreement, and the only article where we do not have a rule book negotiated and adopted yet is the markets provision, Article 6, around international markets cooperation, including in 6.2 the accounting for this stuff. So, it's something that we're obviously quite active in as AIDA, and we'll see through as a top priority for us to hopefully get clarity in a rule book by COP26 in Glasgow in November next year. But circling back then, just on the voluntary space, and I look at just quickly James and Alistair again. James first, so voluntary markets, offsets, CP, Capital Power, you're deeply involved, right, in offset projects, developments, the investments. How do you see the voluntary space, or do you just kind of watch and see if it could go compliance? What's your take on just the voluntary space? James.
Do you want to go first, Alistair, or me? Okay, fine. I mean, I don't have a lot on the voluntary market, Katie. Like, I see it as being this pretty interesting space right now, just because of these conversations on net zero that I think was well articulated. From our perspective, I mean, we look at scope 2 and 3 emissions and that involuntary space, and we're kind of watching what's happening as in the background of protocol development. But our probably primary interest is just seeing where these protocols go that are not yet compliance, but are moving into compliance or have the potential to do that. So I think that's why we maybe know enough to be dangerous around the edges, but we haven't, sort of played more in the voluntary space. It's more of just understanding how it integrates ultimately into compliance and watching that formation from the sidelines.
And go ahead, Katie. Sorry.
Yeah, no, Alistair, go for it. Yeah.
So, I mean, we're starting to work in the voluntary space in the States and down in South America, and I think we're having a bit of a mind shift the way we talk about environmental outcomes. And during the conversation, we've been hearing a lot about carbon credits. And I start to think of it as in a much more broader sense and think about it more about monetizing environmental data that's demonstrating an environmental outcome. And that monetization can take lots of different forms, whether or not it's a transaction in the light of a carbon credit or a habitat conservation credit. These things are growing, I think, in scale and interest. And when we look at, if I'm coming back to the agricultural component around natural climate solutions, the real question is will we ever be able to generate a carbon credit as it's defined by the various carbon accounting groups that are out there? And will we be able to transact on it? And I'm not sure that the answer is yes, for a lot of different reasons, which leads us into this whole construct of or conversation around carbon insetting, right? Or an insetting framework where organizations are able to support emission reductions in their either upstream or downstream, so from their suppliers to their clients, where we can quantify those emission reductions, we can verify those emission reductions, with a high degree of confidence, but we might not be able to put them into a market framework, right? So I think that's something that we need to be cognizant of as we work towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions or removing greenhouse gas emissions, and recognize that the market may not be the right place for all of the solutions that we want to implement, right? Which throws a little bit of a wrench into the conversation perhaps, but I think it's something we need to be cognizant of. And then it becomes this question of, if we're doing that, how do we still apply rules around monitoring, reporting, and verification? And what does that actually look like? And I think when we think about the voluntary space, I mean, Arjun talked about the time it takes for a tree to grow, right? To sequester carbon. Absolutely true. But we know that we can restore degraded pasture lands in Brazil, in the Cerrado, or in the Amazon, where they're sequestering, the science says, a minimum of a ton a year, right? And there's millions of acres of degraded land, but there's no way to bring those reductions to market right now, right? And unleash that potential to create massive amounts of emission reductions while increasing soil health and increasing the carrying capacity of this land, right? So there's all these things that we need to balance out, right? And we do need to create markets that will let us access these other opportunities, I think.
Thanks for throwing a wrench into that.
I was bored. No, I mean, it's.
I think, it actually, if Arjun, you're still with us, did you have any, quick response to Alistair's comments?
Yeah, sure. Happy to opine on that. I fully appreciate the idea of, recognizing other environmental attributes. I think one of the challenges, though, in the voluntary market that we've seen is that, buyers, when they buy the carbon, they're also, selecting certain projects for the co-benefits and the associated benefits that the projects are achieving, which may be related to, habitat benefits, ecosystem restoration, water quality benefits, local health benefits, whatever they may be. So, it's if one is purely looking for the carbon benefit, as one would be in a compliance market, that is one thing. But the voluntary market is really different and quirky in that regard. And buyers buy the projects that they buy because they like the co-benefits that are delivered. So if we start unbundling those things, it actually makes it, it makes it difficult to provide corporates with the product they're seeking to buy, fundamentally, which is carbon with certain co-benefits. With respect to market solutions and whether they're the right way to go to achieve all these aims, I mean, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And as much as we like markets and believe they're fundamental to this, I would concur with Alistair that there may be other approaches that are needed to tackle certain dimensions of the problem.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Thank you, Arjun. So looking at the questions, there are a couple that came through. I also just a reminder to participants, if you want to submit your questions, feel free to do so in the questions box in your dashboard. There are some questions coming in, and we did a quick scan of the federal carbon market now, the output-based pricing system, a compliance market. It's live, but there's some uncertainties, right? Including what's going to happen on the offsets piece and which protocols will be blessed to be, compliance grade. So I think it would be helpful, again, for everybody to be on the same page about how this is happening. It's still quite a live discussion, including like future consultations happening federally in Canada on its offsets program. So Nico, I'm going to come back to you around, do you want to just provide some of just the quick facts on the latest around what we should all be watching for federally on the offsets program?
Sure. I mean, yeah, there's a few things we've been looking at. I mean, yeah, compliance entities now have passed the first year of emissions, 2019, need to comply by April 15th. And yeah, in theory, they should be able to use other compliance instruments such as allowances or offsets. But the reality is that there isn't that much at the moment. And the reason for that is that, yeah, the feds didn't come yet with a list of eligible offsets. So I mentioned earlier, either as a compliance entity, you'll be able to use offsets from one of the provinces of Alberta, British Columbia, or Quebec. But again, we don't know what type of offset will be eligible. And then you've got the federal system where we have essentially no view at all on what's going to be included in there or if anything has been done in there. So yeah, a lot of uncertainty, and same with the surplus credits. Yeah, we really don't expect much supply to be there. So as James mentioned earlier, then it becomes just a carbon tax. Yeah, and so it's not really a carbon market anymore. Yeah.
And so yeah, and we are expecting to see some discussion document coming out over the next couple of weeks, right, by the federal government around 45, 60 day, comment period for to solicit more guidance from stakeholders on not just prioritization of possible protocols, but also some other, governance related elements to the offset system as it actually implemented, including the protocol development process. These are pretty critical, decisions that will have to be made. So there is a question that's come through, and I don't know who wants to pick it up, but around, well, what could in Canada the voluntary space provide to the future federal compliance offsets program? Could we see some voluntary protocols possibly that are, again, blessed or adapted to the federal system? Are there any, thoughts related to that?
I'll jump in right away in that the one voluntary protocol that exists today that people are looking at implementing in Canada is the CARS avoided grassland conversion protocol. And there's a series of stakeholders that are working on trying to develop a project with that, with the intent of being able to move that protocol into a compliance market at some point in the future, right? So that's an obvious one that, well, obvious to me that we're working on in terms of how we might go down that path, but it's still a long ways off, but that would be the intent.
Good answer. Watch this space, right? Watch this space. So one thing that we have not touched on yet, except for a teaser at the beginning, and it was provided in that description, we've been focusing on carbon, obviously, carbon markets. But there is a very big market out there, some existing low carbon fuel standard, California, you have the LCFS in British Columbia. You also have the clean fuel standard nationally, which is a major undertaking that's under development right now. So Nico, your one last slide that we haven't gotten to, but to provide, again, that context of the CFS, I think it's valuable for all the participants to see that. So let me, for that one last time, sure, share my screen.
Yeah, maybe just briefly then I can touch up on the California market and Oregon and BC market, and in those markets as well. So very similar to what we saw in carbon prices. Prices did reduce in the past few months, but again, now we are seeing prices, pretty high prices, yeah, higher than $200 US for the California market. And so again, yeah, like the certainty is back in those markets, despite the lower fuel cells. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, it's going to be a big piece of legislation in Canada because it's going to be a federal system. I think it's the slide that is just before that, Katie. So
am I on it right now?
The previous one, I think. That is, you're showing the one on recent announcement on offsets.
The problem is I can't.
It doesn't matter. It's fine.
I can't.
So yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm going to stop. I'm stopping because I can't see the screen. If I'm going to lose you. Okay, yeah. Sorry.
So the clean fuel standard. So yeah, why is it so important? First, because it's going to be a federal system, so across Canada. Then the second thing is that the target there is an emission reduction of 30 million tons. So it's a very large piece of the reductions and of the 2030 target for Canada. And then yeah, why is it so important? It's going to be as well a new experience because you'll have the liquid sector, so the fuel sector, but also the heating sector and the solid sector, so coal and petcoke, for example. So it's going to be a very wide market. Yeah, obviously because of COVID, there has been some delays. The final regulation is now expected in late 2021, and the start of these systems for the liquid stream, so the fuel sectors stream, would be in 2022, and for the gases and the solid stream in 2023. So yeah, another big piece of legislation. And again, here you'll have three ways for example, a fuel distributor to comply, either by using lower carbon fuels such as biofuels. So really like yeah, mixing lower carbon fuels. You'll be able as well to use yeah, some kind of offsets, essentially, very similar to offsets, upstream emission reduction projects, for example, in gas or oil fields. And finally, you'll be as well able to implement some switches. So for example, switching from one higher carbon fuel to a lower one. So for example, from petcoke to gas, or for example, again, from ICE, so combustion engines vehicles, to electrical vehicles as well. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for creation of credits in general, and again, yeah, like federal system. So it might be like, it will be a very large system, we expect, at least.
Mm-hmm. It's a big deal. Lots are tracking it, and I know James with Capital, at least from the perspective of power, natural gas markets being impacted. You are tracking the CFS. Did you want to share any other thoughts, and maybe even like also just your thinking around and it can get, quite fuzzy and challenging sometimes, but like the key considerations and the interplay between these low carbon fuel markets and then the carbon markets as well. James?
Sure. Yeah. Like just a couple thoughts on the clean fuel standard. So, this is a conversation a little bit, tilted around net zero. And what I think is really interesting, or the opportunity around that, is what, sort of Nico was mentioning. We have transport markets already in an LCFS, whether that's BC, Oregon, or California. This is a bit more encompassing as I see it in the design. So this is something when you think about, going down the road, if you want to decarbonize heat, if you want to decarbonize transport, that starts to put you down the road of those pieces. So I think that's the opportunity that it provides. When you start getting into, sort of the challenge side, well, you start with the prices that you mentioned in California, $200 plus US a ton. If there's, I think the expectation is Canada land somewhere in that region for a clean fuel standard. Well, obviously that's a very expensive molecule of carbon to do those reductions. And I think when you get into natural gas, that's kind of outside of these current LCFS programs, but that's where Capital Power gets interested, because that's an input fuel for our generators. And to the extent that that's, part of it, I would suggest that we haven't even seen a draft regulation for the liquid side yet. There isn't a lot on that gaseous side, but that's a piece where I don't know that there's a good analog to how you approach a holistic policy like that. So it does start to create a lot of questions. But when you start thinking from a price perspective, well, you're putting several $100s a ton on it, you can be raising, put out a number, $1 plus a GJ for price increases for natural gas if you're using them, whether it's for power generation or just anything local within Canada. So on the challenge side, that can get, fairly expensive. It's going to be an interesting piece to watch how that moves forward, and just how it impacts it. And I would say, kind of moving into the interplay between regulations. For example, power generation, we're already regulated as a large emitter. So you're starting to split different chunks of regulation with different carbon prices and different pieces around them. So as I said, creates a lot of opportunity. And if designed well, as Nico was going into, if there's multiple levers, so, if you can reduce at the facility, if you can blend different fuels, if you can use like an offset type credit mechanism, that creates a lot of opportunity. But it's going to be a challenge to put all these pieces of regulation together to have them make sense, to make sure that you're getting, the right behaviors to come out of that. And I think, like, the devil's in the details. We don't have the draft regulation yet. It'll come out this year for liquids, probably next year for the gaseous side. That's where the rubber's really going to meet the road there.
Right on. Actually, you know what? This is a bit of a curveball to Arjun. I hope you're still with us. But I don't know about your involvement in it, if at all, with NCP. But when you were at ACR, you were certainly involved in the CCS protocol for the low carbon fuel standard, Arjun, and you must be tracking it. It's quite something, and it's getting a lot of attention, as it should. Did you want to share anything related to the CCS protocol experience in the LCFS?
Sure. I mean, with respect to ACR's CCS protocol, it was in several years ago, an earlier iteration of it was used. The more recent protocol was not used, but in the voluntary markets in particular, CCS protocols, particularly connected with EOR, which is how ACR's protocol is framed. Those types of credits, they don't have the charisma that voluntary buyers are looking for in offsets, particularly with the perception among buyers that buying those offsets is in some way supporting fossil fuels. With respect to LCFS, we did at ACR put forward to CARB the use of the ACR protocol as kind of a template starting point, and they decided to do kind of a meta review of all that was out there, which is fair. and take another approach on that. But we've seen the same things that you've indicated you're seeing as well. That there's a lot of interest in CCS, and then when you start layering on the incentives, whether a $200 carbon price under the LCFS, and then under 45Q, additional incentives that can come into play. It can start. When you get to the point where the money is there, it can make sense to go that approach. And so we have seen interest in moving in that direction, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some projects that go forward.
It's it's great. And as much as we talk about and certainly are in love with the NCS opportunity and markets driving NCS at scale right across agriculture and forestry and these landscapes, the geo side is also getting a lot of attention, where it was maybe a lull for a little while, but now CCUS as well, and looking at protocol opportunities and markets driving CCUS at scale. It's big. There's a lot of attention being paid, as it should be. And I am looking at the clock. We don't have much time. Yeah.
Can I just make one comment on the CFS and carbon markets, and a movement that's starting? I'll call it a movement, but perhaps the wrong word, but interest that's happening in Alberta right now from some players in the energy sector. And what they're saying, or what they're recognizing, is that we have different sectors of the economy working in silos. And it becomes a question now, how do these different sectors, and the big one in Alberta is energy and agriculture, right? And how are they going to start to work together more effectively, and maybe working collaborative on projects that might to develop more biofuels, or to get source, or to do these other things together. And it's an interesting conversation in that these energy organizations, or the folks leading this, are really trying to reaching out to what are these opportunities for these different sectors of the economy to collaborate so that they both benefit through the reductions of emissions, whether it's through the carbon market or the clean fuel standard or something else. And I think that's something that we need to keep building on, as opposed to working in silos and getting these sectors collaborating on these reductions.
That's a good point. So only with a couple of minutes left, there are a couple, and I think we can do a quick Q&A here. So vehicle electrification, carbon credits. Are there any carbon credit opportunities available for vehicle electrification that you are aware of, voluntary side?
I'm happy to jump in on that.
Yeah, Arjun, I can't see you, but yes. What about you?
Yes. On VERA, or the VCS, Verified Carbon Standard, there are a couple of projects listed. I don't believe that they have yet issued any credits, but there is a methodology that has been developed under VERA for that approach. Yeah, associated with the charging stations themselves.
Oh, I don't have a better answer than that. So, well, there could possibly be some others out there. Alistair, have you heard any?
Yeah, I mean, there was some folks who were pushing for something like that through the clean fuel standard. In Alberta, we had a fuel switching protocol, and for mobile equipment, and it was specifically used in the forestry sector. So we're seeing opportunities where people are moving from diesel generators to solar, and looking at what those credit opportunities are. So I think likely something will come, whether it's the clean fuel standard or something else, but it's really a question of getting enough volume to make it worthwhile as well, right? For being able to
agreed. Yeah, Alistair, that's a good point. Yeah, the volume constraint you need to pull together a lot of fueling stations to get to a reasonable volume for these types of projects. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's say probably the final question here is, what advice would you give to a corporation wanting to buy voluntary offsets to meet their net zero target in Canada? Arjun, even though you are not Canadian, you can absolutely chime in, given that you could buy. Who wants to take that first? Quick, and
sure,
keep it
I'll be self-serving. Call us. But I think the truth is when we think about companies reaching out to buy voluntary credits, I think one of the challenges for companies right now is actually understanding what they should do to determine whether those credits are good enough for whatever they want to use them for. So how do organizations learn to, or how do we give them the tools so that they can dive into the voluntary credit, the methodology, the jurisdiction, the processes that were used to create those offsets, so that they're buying offsets that meet their needs, that are meeting their quality requirements. And I've heard anecdotally that there's a lot of people buying offsets which maybe they're not the best. So I think it's about awareness, and we need, as an industry, we need to make people or these organizations aware of what they can do to vet the credits that they're buying.
Final word on that. Did Arjun or Nico or James want to say anything else on that?
I mean, I'll just add to what Alistair said. I mean, there's a whole range of solutions out there, and if one does want to narrow it to natural climate solutions, even within that, although they might all be exclusively removals, there are other great solutions out there. Improved forest management, which is a combination of avoiding the destruction of forests as well as new growth has seen a lot of success. There's grasslands, as Alistair mentioned. There's wetlands restoration. There's a lot of great natural climate solutions that are out there, and a corporate interested in this can reach out to any of us and learn more about the variety of solutions that can meet their needs.
Well, we'll have to wrap it there. I think we did a very good job. If we didn't get to some of the questions that came in from the audience, I'm sure that the 360 Energy team can follow up with us and put us in touch if you want more information or guidance. And there was a question that came in, and to be clear, my understanding, the recording will be available. Also, the presentations, the slides, we'll make sure that those are available as well. So we're out of time today. I hope everybody enjoyed our virtual kitchen table from wherever you are in the world. I do hope that a lot of us are together again soon in person at some point, but until then, be safe. I want to thank Alistair, James, Nico, Arjun, obviously. It was a great discussion. And David, Don, Julie, the team at 360 Energy for giving us the opportunity and the platform. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate your time. Great discussions had today. Thanks to everybody attending. And as Katie said, the recording will be made available online in the next few days. And if you do have any questions, or if there were unanswered questions, we'll be forwarding that to the team on the screen right now, just so they can give their input as well, and we'll get those answers back to you. So thanks again, everyone. It was a great presentation, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks, all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.